That scene with the soup Nazi who says, "No soup for you."
Yes.
Well, no slides for you. we may get them, we may not. But in any case, let's start. I want to start talking about sort of the shape of the economy overall. We're just putting along here in the roads. We're expanding moderately, but we really haven't recovered as robustly as the rest of the nation. The rest of the nation about 1 year ago finally recovered all the jobs that were lost in the Great Recession starting in 2008. In Hampton Roads we haven't. We're still 20,000 jobs below right now where we were in 2008. So we have a ways to go. If you look at the rate of increase, it's really pretty slow. It's going to take us a couple of years to get back to where we were in 2008. If you think in terms of income, throughout the last decade when we had rapid expansion of defense spending, our per capita income rose above the national average to like 103 or 104 on an index of 100. Now we've sort of seeped back to about the level of 100 and the trend is downward. So incomes aren't increasing as fast either. An irony behind all of this is our rate of unemployment, however, is just about at the same level as Virginia, and both Virginia and Hampton Roads are, 0.6, 0.7 below the national average. So we don't have a high rate of unemployment here. But one of the things that was really going to be on my slides and I was going to talk about is there's this phenomenon out there of a falling labor force participation rate. The labor force participation rate relates to who either has a job or they're looking for a job and can't find one. If you're not looking for a job, you're not part of the labor force, and so you're not in that. Our labor force participation rate in the United States has been falling steadily for about the last 15 or 20 years. And that's true in Virginia, and it's true in Hampton Roads as well. Okay? So lots of people aren't in the labor force that used to be there. In some way or another, it's become possible for people to get around to sort of make it without actually being in the labor force. Okay, why is this? Well, probably the number one explanation, and maybe responsible for about 40% of the change that we've seen, is what's called the discouraged worker hypothesis. There are people out there looking for jobs and can't find them, and eventually they give up. Now, why can't they find them? Well, there's oftentimes a mismatch between people's labor market talents and the jobs that are available. They could probably go out to, I don't know, McDonald's or someplace and get a job, but if they're looking for something different and it requires STEM kinds of abilities or the ability really to calculate and read and write and do those sorts of things effectively, oftentimes many of the people who are in the labor force out there now don't have the ability to fill those kinds of jobs. So that labor market mismatch is a problem, and it's interesting because when I talk to employers here, many of the larger employers tell me they can't find certain kinds of people, that there's a shortage of certain kinds of workers. And at the same time, we have all these people out there who aren't even in the labor force. Well, that's one explanation. Another explanation is that disability payments and disability eligibility has gone up rather significantly. A couple of years ago, an attorney here in Virginia Beach, and I won't supply his name, but he called me and said, "Look, I've got all these disability cases, and I'd like you to give me some economic analysis on each of these." And it turns out that this guy is running essentially a disability mill, maybe I'll call it. And has some doctors who certify that these people are disabled, and then he goes to a certain judge and disability is declared. Well, if you look at the national data, the Virginia data and the Hampton Roads data, disability is going up rather significantly. And it appears as if it's possible for some people to claim disability and make it. I was reading in the Wall Street Journal a week or two ago that it is now possible in Puerto Rico for somebody to claim disability on the basis that they do not speak English well. That would seem to be lots of people on that island, I would guess. But anyway, I'm not saying this is the major explanation, and I'm certainly not saying that many people who have disability don't deserve it. Absolutely they do. I'm simply saying that that would account for maybe 10 or 15% of the decline in labor force participation that we've seen. And that's true, apparently, from the numbers I've seen in Hampton Roads as well. We used to think that demographics were an important reason why the labor force participation rate was falling. The population's getting older, and when you get older, you stop working. Except the interesting thing is, labor force participation rates were falling at virtually every age level, in every demographic, men and women and so forth, but not for people 65 years and older. They're going up. I guess that means we can't afford to retire, or something like that. But anyway, the demographic explanation isn't as powerful, and maybe isn't an explanation at all compared to what used to be the case. Okay? So that's another explanation out there that's gotten some traffic in terms of maybe that's a possibility. But anyway, falling labor force participation rates, and this is sort of a complicated name, are really a problem for society. Because when people are in the labor force one way or another, the rest of society has to take care of them, and does. We end up paying for them with multi-generational families, lots of people living in the same place, or they collect welfare payments, they commit crimes, they end up in jail. There are just a variety of things that happen. And so that's sort of a problem for us right now. It's a problem in Hampton Roads because relative to like 15 years ago, we have 5% fewer people in the labor force in the prime working ages than we used to. Somehow or another, it's become possible for people to get by, okay? And that's something behind the unemployment rates that you see that doesn't get talked about a lot. Another thing I'd like to point out, though, however, is that when you look at unemployment rates, the one you see being talked about on the news and in the newspaper is what economists call the U3 rate. There's also a U6 rate, and the U6 rate includes not just the people in the U3 rate, the people who can't find a job, it includes people who would like to work full-time but can't, because they say they can't find a full-time job. It also includes these people I call discouraged workers, okay? So the U6 rate is probably something closer to what you and I would say, that's the real rate of unemployment. And the U6 rate is about twice as high as the U3 rate. So the difference between those two is hidden or disguised unemployment. And right now in Hampton Roads, that's 5 or 6% of the labor force. Okay? So that also is a pretty big number. So if we look at why Hampton Roads isn't doing well, this decline in labor force participation is one reason. But the elephant in the room is clearly defense spending. It was last year, it was the year before, that continues to be true. Well, defense spending, now direct defense spending is something in the range of $19 billion a year, okay, here in Hampton Roads. And of that, maybe 8 or 9 billion is procurement. And procurement is basically what they're spending at the shipyard and places like that, and buying goods and services. And the rest is personnel. Okay, that number, 19 billion, is actually a little bit smaller than it was 2 or 3 years ago. So defense spending, which had been increasing at 6 or 7% after inflation over the last 10 years, now has tapered off. And that's really been the engine of growth for our regional economy, and that's basically kind of disappearing. Now, one of the other things, though, you should know about defense spending and the like is that right now in Hampton Roads, relative to 2003, roughly a little bit more than a decade, we have 27,000 fewer full-time uniformed people in the region. 27,000 fewer on a base of what used to be something like 120,000 or so. So we don't have as many sailors and soldiers here, and they're not on the roads, they're not spending money, some of them don't live here, etc. If the slides were here, I would show you traffic in the downtown tunnel going between Norfolk and Portsmouth. Sure, tolls have caused that to go down, but if you go back 10 years, you see that traffic has been headed down year after year. And that's because we don't have as many people going back and forth to, let's say, the Portsmouth Naval Hospital, the Naval Yard, and so forth. 27,000 fewer full-time people. Now, the reason our economy hasn't felt that more is that all of those people have been paid more. Compensation over the last 10 years, over the last decade, for military and civilian employees of the DoD went up about 90%. Now, all of that, of course, isn't wages, because we're talking about fringe benefits, housing allowances, uniform allowances, things like that. But that went up about 93% over the last 10 years, whereas the private sector went up less than 50. Okay? So that, too, was a great growth engine for us. Okay? Well, that's beginning to disappear also. President Obama has recommended a 1% increase in pay for military people, and that's in contrast to 2 or 3 or 4% that tended to be true over the past few years in terms of compensation. And here's the real kicker attached to all this. It also, at the same time, is the case that the assets that we're buying militarily, aircraft carriers, submarines and things like that, airplanes, have gotten so expensive that we can't buy as many. And I have to tell you that when there are fewer planes at Oceana, there are going to be fewer people there. If we don't build as many submarines, there aren't going to be as many people here as well. The size of the U.S. Navy fleet has just gone down continuously. And the number of ships home ported here at Hampton Roads has gone down continuously. Fewer ships, fewer people. So when I said that the total complement had gone down by 27,000, a very important reason for that is, frankly, there aren't as many ships here. We're not building as many, we're not repairing as many, and so forth. Now, this most recent budget that came out of the U.S. Congress did stipulate still 11 carriers. And carriers are terribly important to this region, economically speaking, and otherwise. Each carrier task force, all the ships and people and so forth, is worth almost $900 million a year to the region. That's roughly 1% of the regional economy. So when one of those sails out to the Mediterranean or the Pacific or anywhere, we feel that almost immediately. But here's the real danger for us, and it is that as a part of the refocusing from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and the President says we're going to do that, 2 secretaries of defense in a row have said we're going to do that, we're likely to lose a carrier group to San Diego or Honolulu. Maybe not just 1, maybe 2 over time. Now, softening that a bit is the fact that Hampton Roads is really the only place where they can really rehab and refit and retool an aircraft carrier. So every few years, when it comes time to fix them up, they've got to come back here. So we wouldn't lose those permanently. But in terms of the sort of daily, day-to-day kinds of things, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we lost 1, perhaps even 2 aircraft carriers, which again would be a significant blow. To put this in context, you all remember the Ford Motor Assembly Plant?
Yep.
Yeah, that was roughly a $450 or $500 million a year operation in terms of its impact on Hampton Roads. So a carrier is almost twice as important as the Ford motor assembly plant. So that's big stuff for us. In addition, there is unspoken, publicly, very often anyway, the threat, well, it's more of a threat, it's a reality, that they're moving ships to places like Jacksonville and so forth. And they're doing this because they want to reduce vulnerability. They don't want to have all their assets in one place where a terrorist or who else one might think about might get at those. So they've begun to distribute assets around the United States a little bit more rather than concentrating them here, which is, of course, the largest Navy base in the world. And that's been gradually happening, and I suspect that's likely to continue. On top of this, and I'll come back to this theme in a moment, rising sea levels are now really beginning to impose costs on the Navy, and for that matter on Norfolk Southern and the shipyard and so forth. Norfolk Naval Base, Navy Base Norfolk, is of course at sea level, and they have a bunch of assets like electrical generating facilities and so forth right there that they have to now increasingly protect. They have to pay for things to avoid the impact of rising sea levels. Now, I'm not going to get into an argument today or a discussion about why the water is rising. I'm simply saying it is. You can go to Sewell's Point and look at the sea gauge and the water's going up. And you can see it in Virginia Beach, you can see it in lots of places, and that's going to impose costs on the Navy. Over the long term, if we look out 25 to 50 years, the Pentagon may well decide they don't want to have nearly as many assets here because it's too expensive. Now, it isn't that sea levels aren't rising other places as well along the East Coast. Rather, it is that they're rising more rapidly here. It's the same water, but our land is sinking. And that's why our sea level rise is higher. Gazillions of years ago, a big meteor hit here, roughly over about Cape Charles, and hollowed out a huge area here. And in fact, if you're driving out to Suffolk, there's something, if you're looking closely, called the Suffolk Escarpment, where you just go up a little bit. Well, that's the edge of the crater. That's how big that was. Well, all of this stuff that we're standing on right now, it's not exactly swampland, but it's not as firm, as hard as land farther out. So we're sinking, and we're sinking at a rate that is problematic for us. I mean, we can't tell it, it's just that as the years pass, the sea levels are going to go up. Now, let me sort of detour just a little bit and say, this just isn't a problem, obviously, for the Defense Department, but it's a problem for the entire tourism industry in Virginia Beach. I mean, there are ways to take care of sea level increase. You can go to the Netherlands, for example, and see how they handle it there. They've got all kinds of dikes, and they're pushing water in different directions and so forth, and they can take care of storms. But I don't know that we want a big dike right off the beach at 21st Street. That doesn't look very good, and it's going to ruin the tourism industry. So there's a question really of how do we handle this, and then how do we pay for it? Because if you think about who is getting hurt, it's not just the hotels on the beachfront, it's restaurants, it's people around the city. In fact, at Old Dominion a couple of years ago, we did a little study showing that there's a gradient in terms of home values. The closer you are to the water, holding everything else constant, the higher the value of your property. And the farther you get away from the water, the price goes down until after you're a couple miles away, that effect disappears. So there are lots of people who are going to be affected by this, businesses, the city in terms of tax collections and so forth. And the really interesting question, and I don't really have an answer to this, is how do you distribute the costs of remediating or taking care of this? It's a tough question, because all the costs shouldn't be borne simply by the people on the seashore, although they would get a lot of those. But it's similar to the kind of question you would ask if you're saying about how should you pay for a new highway or a new tunnel. Well, you might have tolls because the driver's going through, are obviously getting a lot of the benefits, but so are all the businesses and everybody else. So it's not so easy to figure out precisely how you say who's going to pay what. So that's something attached to economic growth in the region. And I'm going to just sort of make a hard statement here, and it is that rising sea levels is the problem of the 21st century for our region. Yeah, transportation's a problem, and yeah, there's some other things out there, but it's really rising sea levels that in 2050, 2060 or sometime like that, we're really going to say, oh my golly, we have to do something about this, we have to take care of it. And that's a disadvantage for the region. So if you're projecting long-term economic growth in Hampton Roads, you have to look at that and say, gee, that's not exactly favorable. You add to that stagnant defense spending, and the long-term outlook for economic growth here is not terribly favorable. Well, let me switch gears and talk about, one final thing about defense spending. We've always talked about the need to diversify the regional economy. Well, we've gone from like 47 or 48% of our regional economy being dependent upon defense spending down to 40. We've diversified, but for the wrong reasons. Defense spending has gone down and the private economy isn't growing rapidly, so yeah, we're more diverse, but we haven't really done it really for, I think, the right reasons. Let me talk a little bit about the port. The port is doing much better than it was in the past. 5, 6, 7 years ago, the port was losing market share to our major competitors, New York, New Jersey, and Savannah, along the East Coast. And we've turned that around. We are gaining back market share very slowly. They're not losing money at the port anymore, although I would hasten to say their method of accounting for profits is different than, let's say, Walmart or somebody would do that. But they are doing better. And John Reinhardt is a good CEO, but they still have problems out there, lots of which are logistical, handling the traffic. If you ever drive out 164, Portsmouth to Suffolk, you'll see all these railroad cars and trucks and things lined up there. They have a spaghetti mix-up full of problems in terms of how to really handle this traffic. And the traffic's been going up. TEUs, the 20-foot equivalent units that you see floating around the streets all the time, they're up 7 or 8% over last year. They're doing lots more traffic, but they're having problems handling it. Now, what about the Panama Canal? Well, the canal is being deepened and widened, and it's sort of, I guess, a typical public project in that it keeps going farther and farther into the future in terms of when it's actually going to get finished and more expensive. But Panama Canal only handles about 3% of world trade. And yes, when they widen it and deepen it, bigger ships can go through there. But even after they've done that, it will only handle ships at maybe at a maximum of 14,000 TEUs. There are already ships afloat, mostly coming from China, that are 20,000, and there are ones being built that are 25 and 27 and 28,000 TEUs. Those can't go through the canal, they'll have to go through the Suez. Okay? So right now, because we're a deep draft port, we can handle any ship out there. We have an advantage over Savannah, which can't, and over New York, New Jersey. Now, New York, New Jersey is spending about $5 billion on improvements, the major one of which is to raise the Bayonne Bridge. And if you know the geography of it, you have to go under the Bayonne Bridge to get into New York Central, as it were. Well, ships can't do that right now, the big ones. If they want to go under the Bayonne Bridge, they have to take all their cargo out, which sort of defeats the purpose. So they're raising the Bayonne Bridge, literally. And in a couple of years they'll be finished, and then they'll be able to handle big ships. So our advantage over New York, New Jersey, and some of the other ports is going to disappear in a couple of years. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing well now. Another reason why we're doing well now that doesn't have anything to do with our efficiency or anything is they had a big West Coast port strike. And that diverted a lot of cargo and stimulated us in a way that probably we can't depend upon permanently. But the port, if you think of the three major engines of growth in Hampton Roads being defense spending, the port and tourism, of those three, the port's the only one that's really doing pretty well. It's roughly 9–10% of our regional economy in terms of its impact. Defense spending now about 40%. And then the third leg on the stool, metaphorically, is tourism and hotels and the like. That's maybe 7, 8, 9%. Well, tourism isn't doing that well. It's doing better in Virginia Beach than hardly anywhere else in the region. But if you look at Hampton Roads as a whole, our total revenue being spent in our hotels and motels is below where it was in 2007, 2008. In a place like Norfolk, and I'll come back to that in a moment, it's 7 or 8% below where it was in 2007 or 2008. It's slightly above in Virginia Beach, but we're trailing the nation as a whole. Why? Well, people aren't coming here and staying. Tourist traffic has recovered, but people are coming to Virginia Beach, but they're especially not going to the historic triangle. The historic triangle used to have a market share of about 1/3 of regional tourism. Now they're down to 16 or 17%. I've given you this example before, I can remember, but it's simply a case that the attractions of the historic triangle, which I love, I like to go to Williamsburg, Jamestown, or Yorktown, apparently do not appeal to lots of young people, and especially do not appeal to minority young people. There's not a message there. And I know I've given you this example before, but I'll give it again. A year or so ago, I was down in Fredericksburg, Texas, where Admiral Nimitz's home is, and they have a big museum of the Pacific there. Very well done, and it's highly electronic. Little kids can sit there and reinvade Guadalcanal and refight the Battle of Midway, and they're doing all this stuff, and they're attached, they're involved. Well, maybe that isn't appropriate for the historic triangle, but they don't have that stuff there. And so there isn't a strong urge for people to go there, and especially not a strong urge for them to return. You can return to the beachfront over and over again, and maybe even the Busch Gardens, but the historic triangle historical attractions apparently don't attract continuous repeated visitors. So tourism is sort of lumping along. Not doing all that well, and if you adjusted the numbers for inflation, like if you look at RevPAR, revenue per available room, we're way below where we were. And I'll talk about Norfolk for a moment. I live in downtown Norfolk, and a couple of blocks away from where I live, the city of Norfolk is spending $90 million of public money to build a new hotel, which, as you probably read in the newspaper, is getting smaller. They aren't going to build quite as much as they thought. Well, if you adjust for inflation, Norfolk's hotel revenues are 17 or 18% below right now where they were 5 or 6 years ago. And I would simply suggest, I don't see any rational economic basis for building that facility at all. And I've made public records requests of the city for essentially their evidence. And as far as I know, there isn't any evidence in favor of that. What will happen when they build it is probably that hotel will do okay, but they will take business away from the Marriott and the Sheraton and so forth. And that brings me to sort of a theme that I need to repeat on the whole subject of tourism, and it is that public officials and economic development people consistently, especially in Norfolk, ignore what we call displacement, and that is that more people go to the new hotel and fewer people go to the Marriott. It's money out of one pocket and into another. It is not a net gain for Virginia Beach if people go to, let's say, the new stadium, if it gets built, but they spend less money at the Lynn Haven Mall or less money on the ocean front. Only in Norfolk, if they are able to attract new tourists, new conventions, new people, will they come out ahead. Otherwise, it's simply redistribution. It's not real economic development. The classic example of that in Norfolk was a couple of years ago when they gave $250,000 as an economic incentive to a fast food operation, not so far away from Dumars, actually. And I said to them, you just said they're going to collect all these additional taxes and there are this many new jobs and so forth. Do you really think that people are driving in to Richmond to patronize a Chick-fil-A? If not, then these customers are simply coming from existing businesses, and there's no net economic development here at all. This whole displacement discussion is oftentimes in public decision-making ignored. Well, you look at the big three then, and again to some, defense spending and tourism aren't doing very well, the port's doing fairly well, but we have these other kinds of problems, and so the long-term economic growth outlook for us is not terribly favorable. Let me segue, as I was going to do in my slides, and talk about two things that were in the State of the Region report. One is megachurches, and the other will be tolls. Megachurches are an interesting phenomenon. There are several in Virginia Beach. You define these as being a church that has attendance of 2,000 or more every Sunday on average, and there are 14 or 15 churches in the region that qualify. They're, well, like the Wave Church here in Virginia Beach. They're essentially franchised. Many of these mega churches are. Some of the mega churches have even bowling alleys. They have helicopters. They have things for veterans, for young kids. I mean, they're doing all kinds of things. Now, I attend First Lutheran Church on Collie in Norfolk. You have to ask the question. I'm a Lutheran pastor's son, incidentally. I have to ask the question whether in 40, 50 years there will be any Lutherans. Yeah, the people doing Lutheranism now are going to be doing something, but will there be a Lutheran church, or let's say an Episcopal church by that name? Because the mega churches now have more people attending them per Sunday as all the rest of the churches in Hampton Roads combined. I was shocked when I saw that. But you look at the numbers, it's true. And so there's been a definite trend, drift, movement, call it what you will, of especially young people to go to mega churches. I took my two grandchildren out to the Wave Church one Sunday, so I wanted to sort of see what they're doing, and Reverend Steve Kelly is really a nice guy. He's very charismatic, as nearly all the pastors are. And one of my grandsons said to me, Grandpa, let's come here next week. Because if you've been in the Wave Church, you know it's like an auditorium. Really spiffy technology. And, you know, it's lively, there's songs, there's all the stuff. It's a performance. Now, at the same time, I say this is a performance, and they really know that, I mean, someone like Steve Kelly may not have done an MBA, although his daughter did, because I had her in class at Old Dominion. Instinctively, most of these pastors know marketing, they know accounting, they know all these things because they're running a big business. A typical megachurch in the region now has revenues of something in the range of $10 million a year. So they're an economic phenomenon of importance, and which is really the reason why we began to look at them at the State of the Region report. It's an interesting trend. It's one that is sort of happening before our eyes, and it's not just in Hampton Roads, it's happening lots of places. Let me again shift and talk a little bit about tolls. Twice the city of Portsmouth has hired me to look at the impact of tolls on the city. And they suspected, and they're correct, that the impact of the tolls on Portsmouth is far greater proportionally than it is on Virginia Beach or Norfolk or anybody else. One of my slides that I had shows a matrix. of where people live and where they work. So you can look at that matrix, and all of this is coming from government data, and precisely tell how many people live in Virginia Beach but work in Norfolk. And the interesting thing is, Norfolk receives on a daily basis more workers from Virginia Beach than it receives from Norfolk. Okay? Virginia Beach is the biggest supplier of workers to Norfolk easily. Okay? Well, you look at these data and you can tell then who probably has to go through the tunnel. If you're living in Suffolk or Portsmouth and your job is in Norfolk or Virginia Beach, unless you really want to drive around the long way, you have to go through the tunnel. And similarly, if you're on the other side and your job is on this side, you're going to have to go through the tunnel. So you can figure out who has to go. And it turns out that almost 18% of Portsmouth's population, their total population is something like 90,000 plus, 18% of their population on a daily basis probably has to go through the tunnels. It's 12 or 13% in Suffolk. It's something like 3 or 4% in Norfolk, and it's only 2+% in Virginia Beach. So Virginia Beach really isn't affected very much by the tolls on the tunnels. But Portsmouth is, and it's a lower income community besides, and so they're really getting pounded. One of my slides would have shown you, being an economist, we like to do multivariate analyses, where you say, okay, we've got something like taxable sales, and we're trying to explain those on the basis of tolls. But how many military people are in the region, whether the colleges are in session, the month of the year, because that makes a difference, and you assemble a whole bunch of things that you think, these probably could explain why somebody would drive through the tunnel or not. Well, looking at that, I found that there is an annual impact right now of about negative $25 million of taxable sales of all this tunnel stuff on Portsmouth. And I interviewed about 20 Portsmouth businesses. Most of them were in downtown Portsmouth, and they're suffering some of that. One particular business, I won't name because it's sort of confidential stuff, but he showed me where his customers come from. One zip code on the Virginia Beach oceanfront is supplying 60% of his customers. Well, when you get on the news and they say the tunnel is going to close, or one side of the tunnel is closed, or in some cases they close the tunnel completely in one direction, this is bad news for Portsmouth, Virginia. And so, having looked at the books of some of these companies, I can tell you that 6, 8, or 10 of them downtown are going to go out of business. So this sales tax effect, or the taxable sales effect I just talked about, is probably going to go up. Now, part of the problem Portsmouth has then is the tolls, but the other part is the construction and what I would call these negative events, where they announce that there's going to be construction or something, and people see that and they say, well, I'm not going there, or it's too uncertain. Now, summarizing this though, this tunnel project, while the deal that the previous administration did with the Elizabeth River Company was one of the all-time bad negotiations, this is a bad deal. Overall, this project is a good one for the region, but for Portsmouth, not so good, because they're bearing far more of the cost proportionally than any other cities. So, good deal for us. We need this stuff, but it isn't good for Portsmouth. And the deal that, frankly, the McDonald administration negotiated on this was really pretty questionable. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. There are 3 things out there that the previous administration negotiated, big things. One was 460, bad deal, bad negotiation. The other was the Elizabeth River thing, bad deal. But they did some things in the port that were good. That's their real success story in terms of reorganizing the port and getting some things accomplished there. That really was economically sound. Okay, let me sort of come to the end here and say that the region is expanding, but at a very modest rate. The housing market is one reflection of this, doing okay, but not doing wonderfully. The really telltale measure of all of this is migration. We have out-migration from Hampton Roads now. I don't mean the population isn't going up, but that's simply because there are more births than deaths. When you look at the people who are mobile, who are of job-holding ages, we have net out-migration there. We're simply not creating enough jobs to keep those people here. And if you contrast us to nearly every other major city along the East Coast, we stand out by having people leaving us rather than coming in. Pretty pessimistic, but nonetheless, I think fairly realistic. Let me respond to your questions. Yes.
Thank you. Once again, you can prove when you get a brilliant man, you don't need technology to deliver. Yeah, I just wondered, we got a big decision coming down in Virginia Beach with this light rail thing. And I'm about to, I'm sure John is too, take a public stance on, it's not a good deal for Virginia Beach. It's not a good deal for the region. But I just want to make sure that I'm on sound basis. Now, as you know by my accent, I'm from the People's Republic of New Jersey. And we have transit-oriented development here. You go to Manhattan, you've got population density, you've got high rises, you've got a perfect, system of buses and trains and, whatever you need up there. The problem is, people can't afford to live there. It's a lot cheaper to live in Virginia Beach right now than it is to live in Manhattan. And part of my problem with attaching to the tire, first of all, I think it's Betamax technology, in terms of cost and everything. It's on ground, which is going to disrupt traffic more than ease traffic. And the other thing is with sea level rise in Norfolk, why do we want to attach to a system that's going to be underwater? You're going to have to put pontoons on this thing. But the other thing is too, they're talking about it's not going to relieve congestion. And it's basically for transit-oriented development. Now with this I respect, myself and Terry Doherty and a bunch of folks come down here, density is not a fun thing. It's going to, you got that Independence interchange. You already got traffic congestion at Independence. But the thing is, the largest impediments, and you touched on this a number of times, I've heard you, to economic development in Virginia Beach particularly, but in the region, is the congestion at the Hampton Ridge Bridge Tunnel. We don't have a destination airport. And the other thing is, without high-speed rail bringing folks down, I really think that this thing could wind up being, why do we want to assume responsibility for the care and feeding of Norfolk's financial albatross? And that's the problem I have.
You want a reaction from me?
Yes, I need one.
I basically agree with everything you said. Currently on the tide, about 85% of the cost of a typical fare is being subsidized by taxpayers. So there's a redistribution from the people that ride, or to the people that ride from the people that don't. The only way that percentage could change, it might, if you look around nationally, more typically it would be like 75% or 70, but all these public transportation systems are heavily subsidized. Would be if the tide went to population centers. But we are a distributed region. We don't have lots of people in one particular site, but there are some places like the Navy base, Old Dominion, maybe the airport, some places like that. If they went there, that percentage would change because they would get more heavy ridership. But we're still talking about something that's heavily subsidized. And if I were going to get Aubrey Lane to invest $100+ million in something in Hampton Roads, I would want him to maybe even buy down the bonds on the tunnel going into Portsmouth because they're suffering, or worry about the third crossing. A third crossing is something that pretty clearly we need, and I've looked at, I haven't done it myself, but I've looked at the benefit cost analyses there, and that's something that will pay off for the region over time. But this particular project is more glitz and a little bit more a matter of we're big time because we have one of these than actually showing any economic payoff. Final point that I would make is that even the benefits, when you look at them, are confined to certain people owning certain properties or engaged in certain activities. They're not widely distributed over the entire region. And that's sort of bothersome to me, because what we're saying is we're going to build this thing, and then the people who are along this at certain nodes, their property values are going to go up, but literally they will be subsidized by the people living 10 miles away. And I'm not sure that's a very sound basis for doing this.
Can I just a quick follow-up, and I thank you, so much for that answer. But wouldn't also displacement be a major factor, even when you get to transit-oriented development? So let's say you build another 40, 50 restaurants. Is it going to hurt the restaurants in my district, Centerville, which is way, far away from what's going on? I just don't see this being a tangible benefit. And, John and I agree that we need some type of multimodal system. But, but even right now, I'm really kind of offended that it's rolled into this budget where they want to go ahead and buy the vehicles for this thing. That's like buying a transmission of a car before you decide you want to go out and buy a car in the first place. It doesn't make sense. And, I think there's certain folks that really want to shove this down our throat, to be quite frank with you. But I don't think the long-term, the long-term sustainability of Hampton Roads with growth and everything, this is going to be a major, they say it's for the future generations. I think we're mortgaging our future with this.
Yep.
The
Here.
congestion reducing features of light rail here are pretty small. Almost not enough to matter, because it just won't carry very many passengers.
Thank you.
My question's on a larger picture. In 1912, we shifted from a majority agrarian economy in the country into the beginning of a manufacturing economy. And then that carried us through World War II, and then we had a post-boom where we had to rebuild Europe, and we built the Eisenhower highways, and we benefited from that, from manufacturing. Since that time, I've watched the percentage of service sector jobs skyrocket, and the percentage of manufacturing and the producing of goods for export, which is a net gain of money in the economy, since you're bringing money from outside inside. And we've inversed, so we had NAFTA and GATT and this whole North American Treaty and all that. So the port, of course, is affected by that. We're affected by that. Everything's affected by that. But in particular, you were talking about the whole numbers of jobs. And the problem that I see is if we don't reverse the trend, we're so dependent on a service sector economy, which is lower paying jobs. But that thing has to live off of an economic engine that feeds it so that people have money in their pocket to go to the restaurant or buy things in the retail market or even homes. I see nothing anywhere, no discussion about creating any kind of a business or industry here, a manufacturing base, something that has higher paying jobs that would bring money into the region that's not here already because it created exports and would feed the cycle of the service sector. So to me, it appears to be like a bunch of locusts feeding off of a carcass.
That's not what I want.
So my point in all of these things, you were talking about the outward migration and displaced people who have given up and all of these things. Where, anywhere, do we see anything here that looks to bring in some kind of a sustainable economy that brings new money in? I don't see anything. So is there anything?
Yeah, I think there are some things here, maybe not quite so visible. let's think of a firm like Amerigroup. They're here,